Hi, this is Jeff Hastings, and welcome to Chapter 4, Sensation, Attention, and Perception. Let's get started. I want you to think for a moment, how was your life growing up? Just think about the memories that you have whenever you were very, very young, as far back as you can think, and start just thinking about all these memories that kind of come crashing into your thought. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to pause the video, and I actually want you to write down, just as a test, just write down maybe 5 or 10 things that come to mind. Just some of these memories that are really they seem very clear, or they may have seemed like they recently happened and they may not have. And they could be affecting you in a good or a bad way. So, but I want you to just kind of think about what those events would be. The first thing that comes to mind without thinking about it too much. It could be positive, could be negative, but no one, and also realize no one's going to see the list. You don't have to be detailed. Just put down one or a few words that just kind of recall what that memory was and just think about it. So just pause the video for a few moments and write down your thoughts and memories. Okay, so you've written down a few things. As you're thinking about those, what were the memories that were most significant? That really immediately were on that list, that this was a memory you thought of. Also think about, why was it that you thought about that video, or I'm sorry, that memory? Was it because you've actually seen videos or pictures that may just remind you of that event? Is it maybe something that could have been traumatic or painful that you've experienced, and that's why that memory is so vivid? But today we're going to discuss how our brain processes information and that memory is stored. So how our brain is processing sensation. We're also going to talk about how we learn, in the next chapter, but how that brain, it's important to understand for how we learn, how we focus our attention, what we're focusing our attention, but more importantly, how does our brain receive that data and interpret the data in our daily lives? So, and the other thing I wanted to bring up, when you're looking at why you may have remembered that certain memory, is it more about the event itself, or is it more about how it made you feel? And in most cases, there's a feeling that goes along with that memory, is the reason why that it's kind of etched in our brain and why we can recall that so quickly. After today, or what we're going to talk about in this, hopefully kind of, not too short, but hour video or so, we're going to talk about in chapter 4, distinguishing between absolute thresholds, difference thresholds. We're going to discuss different ways that our brain senses data, how we can reduce the amount of information sent to our brain, describe characteristics, and how sound is processed in our ear, define sensation, transduction, what happens with our sensory organs during transduction. We're going to describe both positive and negative effects of mind wandering. Going to find out that over 50% of probably our time, if you're like most people, your mind does wander off. And describe the relationship between sensation, perception, bottom-up, top-down processing, and just sensory transduction. That's how our brain is processing through our senses the information, interpreting that data, and also cultural effects. And of course, at the end, we'll finish with verbal and nonverbal communication. But before we get started, let's watch a quick video that I've posted on YouTube, and I hope you enjoy.
Hello again, students, and welcome to our 4th video and chapter summary on sensation, attention, and perception. As normal, this video has been produced with your professor, Jeffrey Hastings, and supported financially by Ivy Consulting Group, Inc. In chapter 4, we learned about how our senses and life experiences shape our perception and how we see the world. In a sense, we learned the importance of understanding how our perception becomes our reality, as accurate or inaccurate as it may be. Let's begin. Have you ever wondered how your senses filter information before sending it to your brain? We are constantly bombarded with sensory data, but not all of it is necessary. So our senses, those remarkable tools of perception, step in to make the vast expanse of information manageable for our brains. Selective attention, for instance, allows us to focus on what's important while tuning out the rest. Habituation, on the other hand, is our brain's natural tendency to ignore unchanging information. Adaptation is another technique our senses use to adjust to constant stimuli, like the feeling of clothes on our skin. Then there's sensory regulation, which controls the intensity of sensory inputs to prevent overload. Each of these methods plays a crucial role in how we perceive and interact with the world around us. So, our senses do more than just collect information, they filter and manage it for our brains to process. Now think about how you maintain balance and know where your body parts are without looking. The kinesthetic system is your internal GPS, tracking the position and movement of your body parts. It's your brain's way of keeping tabs on your limbs without having to take a peek. On the other hand, the vestibular system is like an internal level, maintaining your balance by informing your brain about your head's position and motion. These systems work in harmony to keep us coordinated and balanced. Ever wondered why certain things catch your attention while others don't? It's not as random as you might think. There are four main factors at play: stimulus intensity, change or movement, repetition, and personal motives. The louder, brighter, or more intense a stimulus is, the more likely we are to notice it. Change or movement in our environment naturally draws our eye, as does repeated exposure to a stimulus. Lastly, our personal motives and interests also play a significant role in what we pay attention to. Attention, thus, doesn't occur randomly. It's influenced by specific factors. Are sensation and perception the same? Not quite. Sensation is the initial gateway, the raw data collected by our senses. It's the taste of a lemon, the sound of a guitar, the feel of a cold breeze. Perception, on the other hand, is our brain's interpretation of these sensations. It's the realization that the lemon is sour, the guitar is out of tune, or the breeze indicates a change in weather. In essence, sensation is the raw data, while perception is the story we tell ourselves about that data. Can culture affect how we perceive things? Absolutely. Let's dive into the fascinating world of the Muller-Lyer illusion. This illusion, comprising two equal-length lines with arrows pointing in different directions, is perceived differently across cultures. For instance, people from Western cultures with their carpentered corners often see the lines as different lengths. However, those from non-carpentered cultures see the lines as they truly are, equal. Our cultural experiences thus have a profound impact on how we perceive the world. How does our perception shape our thoughts, feelings, and emotions? This is the question to ponder upon. Perception, the way we interpret and understand our sensory data, is like a lens through which we view the world. It's not just about what we see, but how we see it. This lens is coloured by our experiences, beliefs, and even our culture, and it significantly influences our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. When we perceive the world negatively, it can lead to feelings of despair or hopelessness. But here's the good news. Perception is not fixed. It can be changed. By actively seeking out positive experiences, challenging negative thoughts, and cultivating a mindset of gratitude, we can shift our perception to a more positive one. This doesn't mean ignoring the harsh realities of life, but rather choosing to focus on the good that also exists. Remember, your perception is powerful. It can shape your world. So what's next in our journey into the mind? Well, we're about to delve into the intriguing realm of states of consciousness. This captivating exploration will introduce us to both our conscious and unconscious realities. Join us in the next video as we discover the complex realms of conscious and unconscious thoughts and their profound impact on our decisions in life. We'll unravel the mystique of our subconscious mind, exploring how it silently influences our choices and shapes the very fabric of our existence. Join us for an eye-opening journey into the depths of our consciousness as we uncover the unseen forces that guide our paths and illuminate the hidden mechanisms driving our everyday actions. Trust me, you won't want to miss this thought-provoking exploration that's bound to leave you spellbound. Until then, keep that curiosity sparked and your excitement ignited.
So in chapter 4, unit 1, we talk about or read about sensation. So the information from our senses can be interpreted, but it also can be misinterpreted. That's a problem. In different ways, it arrives to the brain, that's when it's creating that perception. It's those perceptions that allow us to take that raw material of the sensation and use it to recognize faces, the sound of someone's voice, the scent of a cologne or a perfume. And as we start and we read about this chapter, we really look at the first steps in generating our experiences of the world. That is sensation arising from information picked up by our eyes, our ears, nose, tongue, and skin. And then we go on we start to learn about the decisions which our sensory experiences kind of focus our attention. So something that is more prominent within those senses, that's where we're going to focus our attention. And then we move on at the very end to explore the last step in the process, which is perception. That's how our mind is interpreting that data as it tries to create order from all the information it receives from the senses. But one thing to know about the test, there may be a question on the primary function of sensory organs. And the primary function is to convert forms of energy into electrical energy to help the brain understand and interpret information. So the sense organs, again, that's your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and your skin, that provide the senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and they're there to aid and assist for survival and our development to learn the world around us and adapt as humans, and of course other animals, including even fish. But biological transducers, we'll talk about those in a moment, but that is how we're going to take the data, convert that form of energy into electrical energy to help our brain understand and predict the information. And that's all done when we look at our brain, not getting into it too much, but it's the thalamus that's part of our brain structure that's responsible for really relaying all of that sensory information to parts of our body. It receives different impulses from those. It's as you're sensing that data throughout our body, and it processes it and it distributes it to the appropriate area, that cortical area of our body that tells it what to do and what that information, what it could be. But what happens if our brain is not interpreting that data in the right way? That does create a problem. And that's what psychophysics really is. It's a study of the quantitative relations between psychological events and physical events, or really more specifically, it's between the sensations and the stimuli that produces that, that event. So there's a certain amount of stimulation is required before you can become aware of it. And some people, it may take more stimuli than others that we'll learn about in a few slides. But that there's a minimum level, and when you see those thresholds, there's a minimum level of that sensation that is called for you to trigger an event or that stimulus, and that's called a minimum level of sensation. It's a minimum threshold. And then there's an absolute threshold, is the smallest amount of the stimulus that can be detected. It's usually defined as at least half the time that you're going to notice that sensation as an absolute threshold. It's the only reason you need to know it. It's kind of a term used in neuroscience and experimental research. If you ever get involved with that, that says how much of that sensation can be, or how much can be detected in human senses, including the sound, touch, the taste, sight, smell, whatever. And then there's the differential threshold, that difference threshold you see on the screen, and that's the smallest amount of change necessary, the change necessary to determine the stimulus, that to identify and notice that it's become stronger. Because sometimes these things go on in the background, and if our focus is on something else, we may not notice it. So that differential threshold says how much is going to, when you're focused on one thing, is it going to take for you to notice a change in your surrounding environment? So that's what that differential threshold. And as older we get, the more it takes to really focus on something else other than what our attention is on. So of course, the absolute threshold, that's a minimum amount, again, of stimuli to detect 50% of the time. Just remember that for the test, that 50% of the time. And also, I guess another thing to realize, sensory impressions, what that is, because if you look at the slide title, psychophysics, measuring sensory impressions, that's really the experiences derived from our senses. So all of our past experiences, that's all of our visual, tactical, oral, and that's AURAL, oral. That's from oral, but it's related to our sense of hearing, our ears. Olfactory, and then gustatory sensation. So a gustatory sensation, if you've heard of that, and that really mediates your sense of taste. It is really there to prevent us from eating bad food. So when we have, our tongue and we're sensing different tastes at the very back of our tongue, that have these the taste buds that really allow our body, before something goes down our brain, our throat, that it tells our brain that it's toxic or bad, that creates this feeling of disgust or throw up. So that's what that is in the very back. That's a gustatory system. So I want you to think for a moment too. Do you ever get overwhelmed or anxious in large groups or in big gatherings, or when there's a confined space when people are walking around you? I know I do. I think a lot of people do, and it's because that they're having sensory overload. That is really creating all of these different senses, and your brain is trying to figure out what are the most important senses. Is there a threat? And it can create that anxiety, because it is putting your whole system on this awareness or this heightened state of awareness. And your brain can interpret that as actually a life-threatening situation and could actually cause or trigger a fight, the fight or flight or freeze response mechanism. So sensory overload, of course, is when all the five senses, the light, the sound, the taste, the touch, the smell, all of that is taking in more information than your brain is processing clearly at any one point in time. So when we look at 4 ways to reduce sensory overload, and of course we talk about sensory transduction again, is defined as how the transformation from the external world or environment, how it is being interpreted internally, how our brain is interpreting. So a transducer, a transducer is basically any kind of device that converts one form of energy into another, and like mechanical energy into electrical signals or whatever. And a sensor is a device that it detects or responds to pressure, light, temperature, motion. That's a sensor, which is converting that into measurable outputs. So there's a transducer and a sensor, just knowing the difference between the two. But when we look at our body regarding the senses or our sensor, that's detecting the input, the light, the temperature, the motion all around us, all these different things that are happening in our environment. And then it's interpreting that data and transducing it. It converts it. Just think of transducer, converts it to an energy response. That's either, sweating, increased heart rate, fight or flight, even, those kind of things, or dilation of our eyes, things like that, because it's transducing, it's converting it into energy and preparing your body to have a reaction to it. The only sense that doesn't go through that transduction process for our brain to interpret is actually smell, the olfactory. It actually goes directly to your brain through an organ called the olfactory bulb, actually, and to get interpreted. It doesn't actually go through that whole process of interpretation. It's immediately interpreted. And just one thing to know, I'm not sure if that's on the test, but there are, with some people, lack of specific transducers, and there's considerable selection to occur because our human sensory receptors, they're not always transducing the energies that you encounter. I mean, there's some things that you're going to notice, some things that you won't. Sometimes they're going to be the light waves, you're going to see them more than other people or whatever, or the sound waves and so on. But because of these many other types of stimuli that are being affected in your body at the same time, that you may lack certain sensory receptors, or it's not strong enough for you to notice it. That's why, like with dogs, for instance, very small pitches in sound, they're going to notice where we may not. So there are different ways that animals are in different levels of those transducers that can convert that like a sound wave, for instance, into that energy to hear that sound, where, of course, a dog can transfer or transduce that energy a lot easier. So there's also restricted ranges, things like that. Just, don't want to go into that too much, but there's a lot of very interesting research about those sensors. But there's also something called sensory adaptation. You see there on number 3 on the screen. And that's like if you're walking into a house with a smell of food and you smell it, then later on you don't, or you're working at a place that has music. You may hear it when you first walk in, and then your body adapts to it, your thoughts adapt to it, and you don't hear the music anymore. And that's kind of sensory adaptation that does occur naturally. And the more that you hear something, or the more those senses are in the area, the less likely you're going to notice any change in that. It has to have a certain threshold, an increase in that sound, an increase in the smell, and whatever, for you to actually notice that again with your senses. There's also feature detection, number 4. As the senses collect information, the feature detectors are in the brain that also reduce the flow of sensory input by dividing the world into different perceptual features, basic stimulus patterns. So it's breaking it down. So it's a feature detector is actually a cell or a collection of cells in our cerebral cortex. So if you think about that, that responds to specific attributes of an object or of that wave, that sound wave or smell or whatever. As a consequence of that, your brain only needs to interpret processes that are perceptual rather than the underlying sensory pattern. But that's just feature detection. I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense, but if you think about your visual system, when you're looking at things, there's certain things that you're going to notice and certain things that you're looking at, lines, shapes, edges, that we'll talk about here in a little bit, that you may not notice, or your mind can play tricks on you. And that's called a visual. Certain things are going to pop out to you, and certain things are going to look the same, or they're not going to be apparent. And some people are very susceptible to seeing those, and other people don't see them at all. So we'll talk about feature detection here in a little bit. So just a quick knowledge check. When your roommate turns music on, you likely notice it right away. As time goes on and resume studying, you might notice there's no more. You won't notice the music. What is that called? Do you remember that? Think about it for a moment. And that's your sensory adaptation that I just mentioned. So now let's talk about vision. We're not going to do this long because we can really get into the woods when we get into vision and hearing and all the different things. I'm just going to bring out a few things that maybe on the test or are important for the study of psychology. And a lot of this really can, if you get down into the nuts and bolts or look into a master's program or some more involved classes. But this introduction to psychology, we really don't need to know a lot about that. But just know that, the vision is the first thing that usually, one of our senses that, as we're seeing things and we see the world and our brain is interpreting that data, it really does affect how our thought processes are. And of course, there are different parts of the brain. You can read about those on your own. I'm not going to get involved in too much into that at all. But there may be a few questions on the eye and how you interpret that data. So you want to make sure to at least read the parts of the chapter that we're not discussing here. And it's the same with hearing. There's a couple of things. Let me just mention that maybe a little bit harder to understand, that there's really different processes of hearing that you may want to know. And I think the place theory hearing, so if, which of the following, I think the question says, is hearing that processes higher and lower tones that excite specific areas of the cochlea. It's called the place theory. I just wanted to put that out there because, that is one that a lot of people have missed in previous tests. So I wanted to make sure to just kind of mention it in this video. So but read about that, please do it, and understand a little bit about how we're hearing and what things that are really drawing our attention and what things aren't. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I have a couple more slides on hearing in a moment. So on unit number 4, chemical and somesthetic senses. Chemical senses are really olfaction, like smell, and gustation. Talked about that earlier, the taste that we have with different foods. That these senses convey information about touch, pressure, pain, and outside temperature. So what does some of this mean in like psychology? It actually, that means body feeling. It's a general name for all the systems of sensitivity present in the skin, internal organs, things like that of the body. And kinesthesia, it was actually, I mean, that goes back, over 100 years, refers to the ability to sense the position and movement of our limbs and our trunk. So it's, a lot of it we're unaware of it daily because we do things like when I'm moving my arms or things like that, they're just part of our natural movement. But that's what kinesthetics you've heard of. That is, a lot of people are kinesthetic learners. They have to touch and hold and do things. It's a process of doing and experiencing that to learn instead of just seeing it or hearing it, auditory or visual. And then, of course, we've got your vestibular senses, and that is what's giving us balance. So that is telling us where our body's positioned, if we're leaning, and how our body is. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. Have a slide on it. So when we talk about smell, olfaction, that's receptors binding with the airborne chemicals, and really lock and key theory, just to know that you can really look at details. But if you can think about chemical compounds, or you think about the molecular body of, if you were to put the little diagram with the little, say, zeros or octagon features and how they all connect. And the shape theory basically is just saying that it attaches to similar type of shapes and receptors. So it notices a certain smell when it matches the olfactory senses in our nose. And so the other thing to kind of mention there, anosmia, I'm sorry, not sleep disorder, but anosmia, I think is what it's called. I'm sorry, anosmia. It's like the loss of your smell. A lot of people that lost it even after COVID, they said they lost a sense of smell or taste. But it could be total or partial. It could be because of a head injury, like infection, like a virus or something like that. Or it could just be blockage in your nose. So it's causing a temporary or even permanent loss of the sense of smell, is what that is. And this is just a diagram of the nose that you can look at more. And then, of course, we go to taste buds. There's taste receptors located mainly on the top side of the tongue, especially around the edges, chemical molecules. And also another thing, that smell is a big part of our taste too, for flavor, things like that. And there are 5 different sensations for touch. There's light touch, pressure, pain, cold, and warm. And the skin has about 200,000 nerve endings for temperature, 500,000 for touch and pressure, 3 million for pain. Isn't that wonderful? But pain is necessary because the pain is telling us that something is wrong, something's infected, something not to use because of the injury. So pain is, of course, very necessary part of our survival. There's another part in there, gate control theory. That really, there's 4 different pain theories: specificity, the intensity, pattern, and of course, gate control theory. These are just different theories of how pain is perceived in our body. And it's a perception. Some of us, we feel pain a lot more than other people. We talked about it in one of the previous videos. And this is done 50 plus years, almost 60 years ago, by neurologists, biologists, or psychologists, wanted to process. He proposed that our spinal nerves kind of act as a gate or a gateway that has the pain receptor. It travels through it, and some of these gates are open, some of the gates are closed. And what a lot of people thought for a while, whenever this theory was proposed, that like a painkiller would block these gateways, it's not necessarily that. A painkiller, opiate, really just has an effect for a drug that creates this state or feeling of euphoria or pain or pleasure. And that is so strong that it overtakes the pace, the part of this pain. That's why you don't feel it. But that's also the reason a lot of people get addicted to it, because of that feeling of euphoria, that a lot of people like it and they get addicted to it and want to take these things for forever. And of course, not feeling pain is wrong in so many different ways, because we're not just talking about an open wound or something else. These are psychological pain, other type of pains that it can block you from. So we talked about kinesthetic and vestibular systems. The kinesthetic, again, it's important for mobility, just being able for movement. Vestibular is for balance. And the location for the kinesthetic cell receptors are really in our joints, our muscles, tendons that helps us move our movement and limbs. Just important to kind of know that. So here's a real important thing too about when we look at something like motion sickness. You know, motion sickness, if you think about it, it really comes in, it comes from our ears. And the role of our ears, that our vestibular system, I mentioned that earlier, is it's a network that really is sensing, if you remember, the balance part. And there are three pair in your inner ear. There are these semicircular canals and two sacs, saccule and the utricle. But in these different things, one of them is like horizontal, one of them is about 45 degrees, and the other one is 90 degrees standing right up. And if you think about these, think about like a hula hoop and this little ball in it or whatever. And it's actually, as your body, your head is turning from left to right, up and down, it is actually processing information that it's receiving from your inner ear, that's receiving that balance, and it's matching it or pairing it with what you're seeing. So with our brain, that we take it, we're going to take all that information in, and it breaks down those senses. So what we're feeling and what we're seeing. And if it doesn't match, that's when you get motion sickness. Whenever it feels like, you know, if you've been on a boat and you feel like you're rocking and you get off the boat, you're no longer rocking, but your body, you still feel like you're rocking, you know, because it's not matching. And that's what can create motion sickness. And so there's a motion paradox, you know, what's the definition? Is the type of depth perception cue in which objects that are closer appear to move faster than objects that are far away too. That's just another thing. That's where there's a problem with our visual, when we're taking in that information, that as they become closer, they seem like they're going a lot faster. When you see a car and it's coming by us and it looks like it's moving slow, but when it comes by us, it's very, very fast. That's that motion paradox. So it's our brain taking in these cues, and it's matching it to what we're feeling and how we're feeling, our balance, equilibrium, everything has to be matched. And when everything is in good balance, then of course we feel fine. But when it's out of balance is when we get sick. And a really cool thing, if you ever get motion sickness, to get that system back in order, I learned this from that podcast, that Anthony Huberman Labs I mentioned to you before. He said you could take your finger and kind of point it out and focus on it and bring it back in, and then focus back out. And it's trying to get that, you know, these your brain and your inner ear to get back in equilibrium, and it can help really kind of relieve you from that motion sickness as well. The other thing, of course, what happens in motion sickness? Fight or flight. Your pulse starts rapidly beating. You want to slow down that heart rate. There's ways that you can do that through pressure points, but you probably have heard that before. So just a quick question. Can you identify 5 basic taste sensations? So if you think about these, the tastes that I've kind of mentioned, there are 5 different that are in the book, taste sensations that we're very sensitive to. There are a lot more, but those are the 5 primary. So when you look at it, we've got sweet, salty, sour, bittery, and umami. And I don't know if you've heard of umami, but that actually is one that tastes savory taste in the back of our tongue, the thing that I mentioned to you that can have this disgust or whatever, that your taste buds in the very back, whenever something is very bitter or very bad tasting, it's actually trying to prevent you from ingesting bad food or something that is poisonous. So let's go with attention. When we're talking about how we're taking in all this information, what is going to get our attention and our senses, and what's not going to get our attention? So first off, there's, you know, we're looking at multitasking too. And a lot of people talk about who's a great multitasker. And a lot of research really argues the fact that, can we really multitask, or are we just giving selective attention very temporarily and shifting that from one process to another? And most researchers do agree that it's not really multitasking as much as it is, and we're not talking about like breathing and other things we're not thinking about. We're talking about focused attention, the things that we have to provide focused attention on, or selective attention, when we are focusing on one thing without paying attention to the others. And when we are doing something that we may be working on 2 or 3 or 4 projects all at once, but every time we're moving attention from one to the other thing, we're selecting our attention to whatever's important at that time. So we've got sensory adaptation occurs when we become less sensitive to some aspects of our environment. I've talked about that earlier, about the sound, about at work, or the smell in a house. And it frees us to focus on other things. Our body and our mind, we're really just focusing on things, because think about it from, if you think about how these things are, why a lot of people believe these are there, is because it lets us know that there's something, our senses, in an environment. And once we process that and say that is the smell of a food cooking, or that is the sound of a hammer, someone's working on a house next door, or whatever that is, then we're processing that information and we're ruling out threats to our environment. So once we rule it out, we become less aware of it, and we're focused attention on something else. That hopefully makes attention. Sustained attention, though, when we look at that, is really the attentional system that deliberately seeks out and it maintains attention to events. What we really want, that sustained attention, let's say I'm studying for the test or whatever, and it involves really vigilance. It requires you to do this. It's not just going to happen naturally, and you have to monitor it, among other things. But that's what that sustained attention is, our focused attention that we want to do for longer periods of time because it's important. So several factors that impact the likelihood that stimuli will attract our attention. Of course, it's intensity, the intensity of that sensory input, the contrast between that and the rest of the senses in the environment, the personal importance. Of course, if something's very important to you, you're going to focus more on it. And of course, the goals, that's on there. And I truly think there's one missing there, but I think it's more of our personal desire we may not even think about. But I mean, you think about what the attention may be. Something is not very intense. You don't really notice it. Personal importance may not be there, but you do get something. Let's say you feel good from playing games, but not studying. Your goal isn't to play more games, but yet the environment, and because a certain time during the day, you've got your clock, your body clock, knowing that at certain times of the day that you normally kind of play games, and you get in that habit, that's also affecting our sensations, and that will have focused attention. And there are ways to kind of change that as well that we'll talk about later on. Intentional blindness, and it's also called intentive blindness, I think, occasionally, but it's like perceptual blindness, and it occurs when you fail to perceive unexpected stimulus in plain sight. So something's there, and just because you're not focused on it, there's not any vision defects. It's not like you couldn't have seen it, but you just were paying attention to something else, and it's unintentional blindness where you didn't mean to not see it, you just didn't see it. Then there's change blindness. This is more of like a perceptual phenomenon of not being able to see subtle changes to the environment, slowly turning up music. It's the smell maybe of a food that starts very small, and as someone's cooking, it gets more and more, and you may not notice it right away. I've noticed it with, like, when buildings are staying, they have different lights on buildings and they're changing colors, or you may not notice that it changed color until you're like, wait, wasn't that blue earlier? Now it's purple. Those kind of things is really just what's called change blindness. And researchers really find that distraction increases change blindness, of course. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. But the other thing is, as you get older, that will find older people are less likely to detect changes in the visual seeing than maybe someone that's younger. So that's, another important part of that. Self-reflection. This is just a quick thing that the publisher had put this slide in here, just about, and I think it's kind of nice to do if we're in a live class more so. But reflect on your own life and consider the following. Do you ever lose attention or focus on class or while reading this content? Are you not paying attention now? But if a loud noise were to happen, you're probably going to refocus that attention and do that in a classroom, and it really gets people's attention when you make that loud noise. But what type of distractions do you experience when studying? Are you very easily distracted? And also, more importantly, what can you do to improve and maintain your attention, when you're studying for this course in longer periods of time? It's something for you to answer. But I can tell you where I would start was that focused attention, setting goals, and setting aside, creating a habit. This is when we get into some of the things and some of the experiments that are done, not only here, but we'll talk about in a couple of other chapters with condition response when we get into learning and operant learning. That as you are, if you set certain goals and you notice that certain goals you make and other goals you don't, writing a goal down is important. Of course, that's kind of the first step. But the other thing to have this attention, this focused attention, is you have to be very consistent with it. It needs to be something that's over and over and over again. So you're going to say, okay, at 5 o'clock every day from 5 to 5:30, I'm going to study psychology. I'm going to watch some of the course. I'm going to review the notes, whatever. And as your body gets used to that, you know, your body just knows that is 5 to 5:30. But when you're not doing it at the same time, or there's not as much of a routine, you're less likely to truly do that. So as you're doing self-reflection, just understand that you are in control of this. Like the quick 4-minute video that I created for you mentioned, and you know, your future, your attention, your focus, the way that you learn, your attention can be changed. You can change your future and change the way that your body is reacting to these things with intentional focus. The question is, do you really want to change? Do you want to be average, below average? Are you happy with your test scores, or would you like to see improved test scores? It's one thing to just want to improve. The other thing is to set a plan and a course of action and focus on that. What is it going to take to get an A in the class and an A in any class? And also you've got to think about that benefit. What is the reward going to be for having all A's in high school, college, and what's that going to impact is that going to have on your life? Is it? I can tell you very much will have an impact on your life, whether you realize it or not. Those of you taking this as a dual credit course, or those in younger, they're taking it in college, waiting to enter this work world. The grades can determine where you're going to work, the amount of compensation pay, your future possible spouse, partner, where you're going to meet them. I mean, all of these kind of things really do come into play with, the time you're spending on this right now. So it is very, very important. So mind wandering, mentioned this earlier. There was a Harvard study actually done, I'm not sure the year, but it said almost 50% of the time, it's 46.9% of the time that we're awake, our mind wanders. Your mind probably has wandered at least half the time as I'm talking here. And the reason for that is stress can cause mind wandering. Boredom, if you're bored, if you don't find it interesting, you may let your mind wander. Fatigue, if you didn't get enough sleep last night, or lack of interest, and you wouldn't be interested if you don't see how this course, for instance, is going to affect the rest of your life, then you may let your mind wander because you don't think it's very important. Also, of course, ADHD with hyperactivity, attention disorder also are going to affect that quite a bit. And this problem, whoops, I went too far. Let me go back. It can really become problematic when you have to have focused attention, when you're at work, or of course school with grades. When it requires focused attention, that's when you need to understand how you can prevent your mind from wandering. And I've already mentioned a few things, but there are mindfulness exercises like meditation. You can focus on your breathing, empty your mind or thoughts. You can by journaling, certain things too. If your mind wanders, let's say at school, and it's because you have a million things going on in your life, a lot of that is because you haven't organized everything. So if you start writing down your goals and the things that you have to do that day, like even in this course, minimum, you've got chapters to read, but also there are 3 things on your curriculum that you have to do every week. And the first thing is watch this video for credit. The second thing is you have to post in the discussion board. And the third thing is a quiz. And then, of course, later we have a final project, but you know that. So you need to make sure that you journal, you write these things down, the due dates, and that's going to help you focus because you know exactly what needs to be done to finish that week on time. And try not to push it to the end, finish it as early as you can. Prioritizing sleep, things like that. And one thing on the test that may ask you about mind wandering, and when people's mind wander, usually you're thinking about, it's future oriented. You're thinking about things that haven't occurred that are going to occur. That's typically where people's mind wander, or future events. Perception. Perception is a process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting information from our senses. Important question to know or answer to know. Selection is focusing attention on certain sights, sounds, tastes, touches, smells in our environment. And something that seems especially noticeable and significant is going to be considered saleable or noticeable or salient. There are 4 steps of the selection process. Not sure if this is not the 4 stages that you see on the screen, but the 4 stages we'll talk about in a minute. But there are 4 well, there actually it is. The stages of that perception. There's stimulation, that's understanding that stimuli exist. The second is organization, and that is comparing existing knowledge, your background with the stimuli, is this harmful or a threat? The other thing is how you're interpreting it, the interpretation, making meaning of the stimuli. And the fourth is, of course, memory, and that's storing our own experiences about that stimuli to interpret that data. So when your brain organizes and interprets a sensory information into kind of meaningful patterns that kind of make sense for your body, then that creates an environment where it's natural and you can have this calm state, whatever. But what happens when your mind and it's interpreting this data, of course, the wrong way? There are illusions that occurs because of perceptual misconstruction in the way that's sent to the brain. You see that on the screen. And then the hallucination is people perceive objects or events with no external reality. It's a hallucination. It's made up. And that could be on the test as well. Synesthesia, I always think of that because that is a video and AI video program that I use, synesthesia. It's a clinical condition in which sensory impressions cross normal sensory barriers. And it's really distinct from neuroscience. The concept of it in arts is regarded as like simultaneous perception of multiple stimuli, is really how to say that. So there's a Gestalt experience is part of it, but it's where you're having all these different stimuli coming and you have this simultaneous perception of everything, all the events going around you. And then the last one there, perceptual construction, is kind of the mental mode of external events. So, on the test, you may see questions about hallucination. That's where you're perceiving objects or events that have no external reality. I've already mentioned that. And also, perceptual construction is just that mental mode of external events. You may want to know that as well. So now the processing information could come in 2 different ways. The way that we're processing that stimuli, it could come from top down or bottom up. And top down is easier to understand that first because it's perceiving things based on prior experiences. So we have that prior experience and that knowledge of what we already know, and our senses are going to make use of that information to process the information. So it's usually processed a lot quicker and it interprets that sense. But bottom up processing really refers to kind of novel experiences. They're new. We haven't accomplished it. It's entirely new to us. So it takes a little bit longer for us to process and analyze that information because it's brand new. And we're trying to organize a perception by beginning with, it says low level features or whatever in there. And that's really, it's a form of processory with sensory data. It goes up to the brain's integration of the sensory information. Are like, and the things like this could be problem solving when you're brainstorming with someone, or solving a math problem, creating new software if you're a software engineer, things like that are brand new. You have no prior information from it, and you're creating. It's creative. That's when it takes a little bit longer, and also it can become very confusing. So, the bottom up processing in the context of sensory information, it's organizing perceptions from the beginning. And it says with low level features, just meaning we're starting from the basis of 0 and we're trying to create how are we going to interpret this data? Where top down processing, just know that is prior knowledge exists and it's quicker with that prior knowledge or expectation. So transduction, that occurs by allowing the senses to change sensory information into perceptual information. So that's transduction. We talked about it. And what it means to have transduction in our brain, it occurs when our sensory receptor converts a type of that stimulus energy. So it could be, a photon from our eye perceiving it, or a sound wave for our ears interpreting that data into the electrical impulse that can be interpreted. And it's of course affected too by our experiences, our environment, and through adaptation. So years and years of our experience in growing up in Western society, that actually can prevent us or even confuse us when we see certain objects, because we're used to seeing everything in Western society as kind of like with all the buildings, they're vertical and the horizontal lines and everything kind of matching. As you can imagine, this when it's a 3D image and we're looking at things, our mind can play tricks on us because we're used to these angles, these 90-degree angles, for instance. And transduction is really the first step towards perception, because that's as we're receiving the information in our senses, we're transducing, we're interpreting that data, and all of those different cells react to the stimuli, to our central nervous system, resulting in what we experience as sensations. So like if you're looking at that fork though, kind of confusing. Does it have 3 prongs? Does it have 2? Where's the third one coming from? It's kind of it tricks people in Western societies. Now I'll show you a better one here in a moment, but where you're seeing things like with the 3D box or different type of images, the Mueller image we'll see here in a moment, where we may be a little bit more confused than someone in different environments or societies. So perceptual differences to transduction. Most older people, if you haven't figured this out, we can't see, hear, feel, taste, smell as well today as we did in the past, like we did 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Why? And it's basically a normal aging process causes that gradual loss in these perceptions, these senses. It usually starts around the age of 50, sometimes a little bit before, sometimes after. And a lot of people think, well, is this kind of genetic or is it environmental, our senses? And really, they're kind of part of both, but we're not sure how much is actually genetic and environmental. So there's really not a whole lot of research into that. But what the research that is there, what they're usually taking a look at, there's certain disorders when our brain is not interpreting the data the right way. And there's something called sensory processing disorder, SPD. And it usually means that people are oversensitive to the environment, the stimuli, that normal people, or I say normal, the average person is not affected by that, but some people are overly stimulated. And on the other hand, there's a lack of sensory input, because it can have the opposite effect too, where it can actually cause different problems where you can't sense it. It can also cause problems like, for instance, I wear hearing aids. A lack of hearing, for instance, has been shown that it could lead the risk in developing dementia because of the causes of social isolation, not hearing other things that other people hear, and could lead even to depression if you're not careful. So that's with sensory processing disorder. One of the most common SPDs is called sensory modulation disorder, and it is trouble regulating responses to stimulation. You can't regulate it, self-regulate as easily. They're either people like with SMD, sensory modulation disorder, either are under or over responsive, their nervous system is, to ignoring the stimuli, either overreaction to multiple stimuli or ignoring the stimuli. And it leads to abnormal sensory seeking, or really not seeing any stimulation whatsoever. So here is the Mueller, I mentioned this liar illusion, where we're looking at, especially in Western societies, they actually call it weird. It's the Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies have a harder time seeing buildings like this. And when you're seeing the building, you see the 2 red lines, which one is longer? And of course, this one in the corner looks a lot longer than this line, and it's not. These are exactly the same size, and you've got an illusion here. And it just means that our perception is different. It's important. And the reason why this is important in psychology is just to understand the way we see the world can be different than other people. Our perception of the world is not just, and we're talking about here our senses, our eyes, our sound, the smell, all of these senses that come at us. And you're thinking about, how does that really affect us psychologically? Well, our perception of this world, and if we grew up in an environment that, let's just say, is what we consider to be a disadvantaged environment, or someone that very low income and There's gang-related violence and guns and all this other kind of thing that happen in one environment. The person that grows up in that environment is going to see the world a lot different than someone that grows up in this very sheltered, suburban, wealthy environment. And those perceptions of the world as you grow, and then we mix up everybody in the same work, just understanding that these differences really come into play when we're looking at these psychological effects. And there's some good, there's some bad, but you just right now just need to know that those perceptions are real to us. Your perception of how you see the world and then you interpret that data is your own reality, and that own reality can be changed, not fixed. It's hard to change, but it can be changed, and that's why it's so important to know how this affects us psychologically when we get into, of course, the psychology of it. So effective communication, very important thing to know too, as you're entering, from school to academia, and you want to move to the work life or, your work world. Even in personal relationships, communication is extremely important. It's not just to understand when you speak or you communicate either nonverbal, verbally, the way you're communicating is going to be interpreted by different people in different ways. So great emotional awareness and your high emotional IQ, if you've heard of that, is understanding how your actions, reactions, how your communication, how is it being received to the other person? How are they interpreting that data? So if you're very high emotional IQ means you not only understand the way you are saying things, you're understanding how that other person is interpreting it. And if they're interpreting it the wrong way, how you can correct that communication style. So communication is so important. And in this high-tech world, communication isn't just limited to, we always talk about written, it's text messages, it's social interactions on social media, all this other kind of stuff. And that's why these emoticons and everything are so important, because it can actually kind of put in the way that you're feeling. If it's a laugh, ha ha, I'm just being funny, or if it's a serious, but overly using exclamation points, for instance, really comes across to the reader as someone that may be angry when you don't mean it that way. You're just really excited and you're saying something, but it could be interpreted the wrong way. So it's just understanding being an effective communicator means understanding that. And, my mom one time, I'll just tell you a funny story. She thought that LOL meant lots of love. And when a friend of hers had her husband die, my mom said, "I'm so sorry to hear about Bill, LOL." Of course, not lots of love, it's lots of laughs. And that's just one thing in communication. Her friend's like, "What the heck? Why is that so funny?" And my mom's like, "Why did she not respond for so long?" And then she responded like, "Why do you think that's funny?" And I'm like, "Mom, that's lots of laugh. It's not lots of love." Anyway, communication is important. Receiving information, of course, reading and listening, certain things to do when you're trying to be a better listener, a better communicator. And of course, receiving that information is more important than you speaking in some cases. And you need to listen more, of course, than you talk when you're in a social situation by asking certain questions, show that you're interested, listening through nonverbal cues to see if they're backing off, if they're crossing, just certain things they could do in nonverbal communication to see how they're responding. And keep an open mind when listening. Don't be thinking about that next thing you want to say, because often you're not going to hear what they're saying and it's going to come off as rude or just not really caring. Asking clarifying questions when you're not sure if LOL meant lots of laughs or lots of love. When you see it, it's better to get to it and say, "Hey, this is what I meant. Did you hear it this way?" And then it gets to the bottom where it does become funny, saying, "No, that's not what it means." But ask clarifying questions, focus on what's being said, and also an engaged listener often answers a person's question before the question's been completed. And you don't want to be too engaged listener. Engaged listening also, you want to be emotionally aware of listening to the full question before it's finished, or after it's finished, waiting till it's finished. So now writing and speaking, I'm not going to get into this too much, but just realize there are certain things like an I statement. And just what that means is when you say I, you're focusing on your own feelings, your own experiences, and it doesn't focus on the perspective of what the other person's done or failed to do. If you say you, when you're saying you, that's very direct, causes a lot of problems, causes arguments, and you can't tell someone how they feel. You want to say when this was said, I felt this way. That's taking that responsibility, this responsibility for your own feelings, but these are I statements. And it allows you to have a better conversation, more open, but not pointing the finger or, so just understanding what that I or we instead of you may mean. Real important thing to understand that. So then you get into what the impression you're trying to convey, communication, you can read more about that later. When preparing to give a presentation, which communication-based skill indicates your audience is paying attention? So what would that be? So when you have an audience and they're paying attention, they're either going to be nodding their head or maybe taking notes, things like that. That just means it's a nonverbal that they're focused and paying attention. So a summary of what we talked about today. We're finished up about an hour, and we define sensation, transduction, and an outline of what happens in sensory organs during transduction, described how information is processed through your ears, eyes, tongue, nose, and body, indicators that influence whether we pay attention to a stimulus. We describe the relationship between sensation and perception, contrast bottom-up, top-down processing. These are important test questions and distinguishing between these verbal and nonverbal communicators. And I want to thank you for listening. Next class, we're actually in chapter 5. We may not have any questions on the test. However, I want you to read chapter 5. There could be a few questions from chapter 5, but the most important are going to be chapters for this week, chapter 4 and chapter 6. So the next video you may see may go straight directly to chapter 6. But thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you until next time.